Welcome back to the U.S. Navy History Podcast. I am Dale, and I'm joined by Christoph.
Hello, everyone. So glad to have you here, or to be back, or both. Yes, both.
We're going to step away from World War II because Christoph had a request for an episode.
So it'll be a good one, is what you're saying, right? Yeah?
I'm saying that I honor your request.
Okay, that's true, you do. This guy's all right.
Whether it's a good one or not, we'll find out at the end.
Okay.
In the summer of 1815, the United States did something no European power had dared to do for centuries. It stopped paying tribute. For over 300 years, the Barbary states of North Africa, Algiers, Tunis, and Tripoli, had terrorized Mediterranean commerce. Their corsairs seized ships, enslaved crews, and extracted ransom and annual payments from Europe's wealthiest empires. Britain paid. Spain paid. Even great navies accepted piracy as the cost of doing business. But the United States, newly independent, still young, still limited in resources, chose a different path. It chose confrontation. To understand the significance of 1815, we need to understand just how entrenched the Barbary system was. The corsairs of North Africa were not criminals operating in shadows. They were state-sponsored naval forces, operating openly under the authority of local rulers known as Deys and Beys. Captured sailors were marched into slave markets. Some were forced into hard labor. Others rode galleys until death. Many vanished into private households across North Africa and the Ottoman world. By the early 19th century, thousands of Europeans and Americans had passed through these systems of bondage. Some were enslaved for months, others for years. Some never returned. Western governments responded not with war, but with money. For centuries, European powers treated Barbary piracy as inevitable. They paid annual tribute in cash, naval stores, weapons, and even ships. Diplomats negotiated ransom rates, the way modern governments negotiate tariffs. It was cheaper to pay than to fight. Even after independence, the United States followed this pattern, reluctantly. American merchant ships were seized. Crews were enslaved. Congress authorized payments because the young republic lacked a navy strong enough to resist. But this arrangement sat uneasily with American ideals. Paying ransom felt too much like submission. Then came the War of 1812. Against the world's greatest navy, American frigates fought and won a series of stunning single-ship victories. The war forged confidence. It also forged leadership. Men like Stephen Decatur, already famous for his daring raid to burn the captured frigate Philadelphia in Tripoli Harbor, emerged as symbols of American naval resolve. By 1815, the United States Navy was small, but hardened, and it was done playing. During the War of 1812, while the United States was distracted, Algiers resumed attacks on American shipping. Treaties were ignored, ships were seized, were enslaved. When peace returned with Britain, President James Madison and Congress moved quickly. There would be no negotiations. There would be no tribute. There would be no ransom. Instead, there would be war. In May 1815, Commodore Stephen Decatur was given command of a powerful squadron, 10 ships, and more than 1,200 men, and ordered into the Mediterranean. This was not a defensive patrol. It was a punitive expedition. Decatur's instructions were clear. Confront Algiers. Force a settlement. End the practice. Shut up.
I said nothing. I just slightly smirked. You're good.
End the practice of American enslavement permanently. For the first time, a Western nation was sailing not to bargain, but to compel. Decatur carried treaties already written. They demanded immediate release of all captives, no future tribute, no ransom payments, full reparations for seized property. These were not opening positions. These were ultimatums, and they would be delivered at gunpoint. As Decanter's squadron crossed the Atlantic, few believed it would succeed so cleanly. European diplomats expected months of negotiation. Some expected failure. Others quietly hoped the Americans would fail, so they would not have to challenge the system themselves. But Decanter was not coming to debate. He was coming to end a centuries-old practice, quickly, and within days of reaching Algerian waters, he would do exactly that.
I think so. The reason I was so fascinated by this story is it's such a different mindset of what I experience now. I know that there are pirates modern day off the Somali coast, for example, but it's never common practice for politicians or high-ranking folks in our society to say, this is what I think the ransom rate should be. Or, no, I think we should negotiate this way. That's never the case. It's always, yeah, they need to be defeated. And I think this was the seed of that. Most certainly, having gone up against and defeated what was at the time the greatest navy in the world was enough to say, if we can do this, we can take out these guys. But that always makes me wonder why the British themselves were like, hey, we rule the waves. We can take care of this. And I'm really unsure as to why they didn't, given how much they were losing, not just monetarily from the ransoms, but also materially. Like that was taking away from everything else they were trying to do. So I love examples of the U.S. just saying, this is the right thing to do, and we're going to go do it. End of story.
To try to answer those real quick,
Yeah.
This is the beginning of the era of the United States gunboat diplomacy.
Mm-hmm.
This is the U.S. changing the world fundamentally and how it works. You have to remember that during this time, the British was worldwide with its reach. It couldn't afford to concentrate on just one area, because if they did that, all the other areas they were controlling would have the issues develop. They were stretched way too thin for how much they controlled.
That's a good point. I know just before this time frame, though, they had commissioned the West Africa Squadron stop the transatlantic slave trade. And so Britain was already on board with, hey, slavery's bad. We're going to forcibly stop it. And so they did it in that case, but not in the Mediterranean case, which I think is, I'm sure there were numerous complexities, and it's not as black and white as I'm making it out to be, but it's interesting.
On June 17th, 1815, off the coast of Spain, lookouts aboard the American squadron spotted sails on the horizon. This was no merchantman. It was the Algerian flagship Mushada, a powerful frigate commanded by Reis Hamida, one of the most feared corsair admirals in the Mediterranean. For years, Hamida had preyed on European shipping with impunity. His name was spoken with a mixture of fear and resignation in ports from Naples to Lisbon. Now, unexpectedly, he had sailed directly into the path of the United States Navy. Decanter wasted no time. Signals snapped across American masts. Ships spread out. The chase was on. The Americans had the advantage. Their ships were fast, their crews were experienced, and the gunners had learned accuracy the hard way during the War of 1812. As Mushada attempted to flee, American frigates closed the distance relentlessly. When the first shots were fired, there was no hesitation. American broadsides slammed into the Algerian flagship with devastating effect. Rigging was shredded, masts splintered, gun crews were torn apart by iron shot. Reis Hamida fought back fiercely, but this was not the sort of enemy he was used to. The Americans did not break off. They did not seek negotiation. They pressed the attack. During the exchange, a cannonball struck Hamida, killing him outright. The psychological effect was immediate. The famed Corsair commander, whose reputation had loomed over the Mediterranean, was gone in an instant. With their leader dead and their ship crippled, the Algerians had no choice. Struck her colors. The capture of Mushara was more than a tactical victory. It was a message. Strongest Corsair frigate had been taken within days of American arrival. The myth of Barbary naval invincibility collapsed just as quickly. Word raced ahead of Decanter's squadron towards Algiers. Fear followed. Only days...
No. I'm just into the story. Continue.
Only days later, the Americans captured a second Algerian warship, the brig Estido. 2 enemy vessels, 1 legendary commander dead, all before Decanter had even reached Algiers. The campaign was unfolding faster than anyone expected. Decanter understood something critical. Every day mattered. If he delayed, European powers might intervene diplomatically, or worse, try to restore the old system of tribute. So he pressed forward immediately. His squadron sailed straight for Algiers harbor. Guns ran out. Decks cleared for action. There would be no prolonged blockade. There would be no drawn-out war. Decanter ended to end this in days, not months. As American ships anchored outside Algiers, the reality became unavoidable. The city's defenses were formidable, but outdated. Its fleet was weakened, and no European navy was coming to help. The balance of power had shifted, suddenly and dramatically. For the first time in centuries, a Western navy had arrived, not as a payer of tribute, but as an enforcer of terms. Inside Algiers, the Dey faced an impossible choice: fight and risk destruction, or submit and abandon a system that had enriched the state for generations. Stephen Decanter gave him no time to stall. The ultimatum was delivered, and it was absolute.
That is crazy. I guess there's a lot going on here, right? So the first part that I find wild is that there was a concern that the European powers would intervene to reestablish this horrible system that they were the victims of. And that doesn't make sense to me. It's not like they're trading partners and, let's just get them back on their feet so their industry or whatever can be reestablished and we can help that society. Yeah, they're living off of stealing from us, and the fear is that somebody's going to come in and restore that. And I don't know, perhaps I'm naive, but that seems crazy. So I think the Commodore here is completely right to press the attack. And I suppose that the Algerians were so confident in their, I don't know if untouchability is a word. Probably not. Grammar police, feel free to give me a shout out. But their inability to be attacked at home, they never thought about that. It never even dawned on them. And yeah, why? We have guns. Yes, they're old, but they're there. And they're not even going to come here anyway, so what's the big deal? And now somebody's there, and they need to react, and they are not ready. And so just flashes of A Bug's Life is flashing in my head where the ants finally stand up. And it's like, yeah, you need us. And we're not afraid of you. There are more of us than there are. And then boom, we're going to come after you. But picture them with bigger and faster ships. So it's like A Bug's Life at sea. That's what's happening now.
To try to explain your questions,
Okay.
I think the fear about the European navies interjecting would be because they want to deal with a devil they know instead of dealing with a devil they don't know.
That does make sense. If you squash this, what happens?
They know this system. It sucks, but it works. What happens when these upstart young Americans come in and destroy this system? What's going to fill that vacuum?
Yeah, I guess America does have a history of removing the devil we know and then being surprised by, uh-oh, what do you mean you don't like the Shah, etc.
You also need to understand that old world thinking is still very prevalent during this time, and America's coming in and changing all of that. And it is scaring the bejesus out of everybody.
I imagine so. Like, this is a paradigm shift on how you deal diplomatically and internationally. And so I'm glad this move was made. I think it is a net positive, not just for the time, but going forward. But yeah, just like I said at the beginning, trying to put myself in that mindset of back then is so foreign, and it wasn't that long ago.
Stephen Decanter did not sail into Algiers harbor cautiously. He sailed in ready to fire. American ships anchored with their guns run out, crews at quarters, powder ready. This was diplomacy conducted at the muzzle of a cannon. For the day of Algiers, the message was unmistakable. For centuries, Algiers had been a city that negotiated from strength. European consuls came hat in hand. Tribute ships arrived on schedule. Threats were answered with chains and dungeons. No Western power had ever entered the harbor prepared to enforce demands immediately. Now, the Americans were there, and they were not waiting. Decanter sent word to the Dey with terms already written. There would be immediate release of all enslaved captives. No future tribute of any kind. No ransom payments, ever. Full compensation for seized American vessels and cargo. This was not a proposal. It was an ultimatum. And it came with a deadline measured in hours, not weeks. The Dey searched for options. France was not coming. Britain was not intervening. Spain and Portugal watched silently. For generations, Algiers had relied on European rivalry to protect it. That system had failed. Now there was only the American squadron, and the knowledge of what had already happened to Mashuda. Faced with overwhelming firepower and no diplomatic escape, the Dey of Algiers did something unprecedented. He surrendered. The treaty was signed aboard Decanter's flagship, not in a palace or consulate. There were no concessions extracted from the Americans, no payments promised, no future obligations. The Barbary system, as it applied to the United States, was over. Then came the moment few outside Algiers truly understood. The dungeons were opened. Men emerged who had not seen daylight in years. Italian sailors, Spanish fishermen, Sicilian merchants, Portuguese traders. Some had been enslaved for over a decade.
Whoa.
Many had been given up for dead by families who never stopped wondering. Now, roughly 500 captives from 12 nations walked free. Eyewitnesses described men blinking in the sun, barely believing what was happening. Some fell to their knees, some wept openly, others stood silently, overwhelmed. This was not just an American victory. It was a human one. The treaty demanded reparations, not symbolic ones, but material compensation for ships and cargoes seized illegally. This mattered. It established a precedent that piracy against Western commerce would not be answered with payment, but with force. The era of ransom diplomacy was ending. Decanter did not stay to celebrate. He understood that power fades if it pauses. Within days, the American squadron weighed anchor and sailed east, towards Tunis and Tripoli. The message would be delivered again and again.
I have to imagine that the people that were released, that was a life-changing experience, not only when they were captured, but also when they were released. And I have to imagine that their appreciation for America, regardless of where they were from, just amplified by orders of magnitude. And I actually wonder if those families were more likely to try to emigrate to America as a result. as like a let's see what we can do to help this country that finally came to our aid type of attitude. Yeah, it's not just a mindset shift that the Americans are proposing here, like how you deal with an enemy like this, but there are always unintended consequences. But I can imagine that the families directly affected from the liberation would have been grateful. I can't even imagine that. This is such a mind-blowing story. I can't even imagine the freedom and the sense of, oh, I'm not a slave in North Africa anymore, even though it's been that way for 10 years. I get to see my family again. I get to sail the waters of the Mediterranean again. That's incredible.
It probably did sway a lot of people to immigrate to the United States. They're like, all these other countries are just not doing anything. Mm-hmm. And then the United States comes in and says, we ain't taking no for an answer. We ain't paying you anything. Give us the people or we're going to kill you.
Yeah.
That sends a heck of a powerful message.
Absolutely. And I have to imagine that anybody that was willing to be a merchant or sail in the Mediterranean at this time with the threat of the Barbary Corsairs, they already have an above average, I think, bravery level. You know what I mean? You got to be courageous to be able to face that as a consequence, and they did. And so that kind of tenacity or courage is what motivated, like that's what separated a lot of folks that did decide to emigrate. So who knows? If you are a listener that is descended from one of these former slaves, please contact us because I would love to hear your story.
And I would love to know how you traced your family tree back to these specific men, because I would love to have my family tree populated like that.
Yeah, that'd be incredible. I know in this podcast we've covered a lot of different stories where America has intervened very forcibly, and sometimes we'll go, maybe that wasn't the best idea.
Let me correct you there. A lot of times, especially during this time.
Yeah, there's a lot of, hey, we're big enough to make our voice heard. I'm having a hard time seeing the drawbacks of this move. Like, I understand that this is still a time in America where slavery exists, early 1800s. That doesn't mean that you can't do the right thing in some capacity and protect your citizenry. I don't know. Sometimes when you make a move and it isn't a wholesale move, some people will criticize us. You're doing this, but you're not releasing the slaves on your end. Understood. Yes, those are both bad things, but a step in the right direction is always good. And this certainly was one.
Absolutely. The surrender of Algiers sent shockwaves across the southern Mediterranean. In the palaces of Tunis and Tripoli, rulers read the terms of Decanter's treaty and understood something immediately. This was not an isolated event. It was a new American policy. Decanter's most powerful tool was not just his guns. It was his speed. He did not linger in Algiers. He did not allow rumors to fade. He sailed east almost immediately. By the time his squadron appeared off Tunis, the news had already arrived. The capture of Mushada, the death of Rais Hamida, the forced surrender of Algiers. The message was clear. Resistance would be brief and costly. The Bey of Tunis had long balanced between diplomacy and opportunism. He had seized American ships during the War of 1812, assuming the United States would never return in force. Now, American warships lay offshore. Decanter delivered his demands calmly, without embellishment. There would be no seizure of American commerce, full compensation for past losses, and immediate compliance. The Bey did not test him. Within hours, Tunis agreed. There was no battle, no bombardment, no bloodshed. Power had done the talking already. Next came Tripoli, a city that already knew Stephen Decanter's name. 10 years earlier, during the First Barbary War, Decanter had led the daring nighttime raid that burned the captured frigate Philadelphia in Tripoli Harbor. That memory had not faded. When Decanter returned in 1815, Tripoli's leadership understood exactly who they were facing. Once again, demands were issued. Once again, compliance followed. That system that had once enslaved Americans and thousands of others had no appetite for a renewed fight. What makes the 1815 campaign remarkable is how little fighting it required. The decisive battle had already happened. Everything that followed was momentum. Decatur had demonstrated something the Barbary states had not faced in centuries: a Western power willing to enforce consequences immediately. For generations, European governments had treated Barbary piracy as an unchangeable fact of life. The United States treated it as a problem and solved it. Within months, American captives were freed. Tribute systems collapsed. Ransom diplomacy ended. The Mediterranean was no longer a hunting ground for state-sponsored piracy. European powers watched closely. Some were embarrassed. Others were inspired. Within 2 years, Anglo-Dutch forces would bombard Algiers into complete submission, finishing what the Americans had begun. Appeasement had failed. Force had worked. The Barbary states did not vanish overnight, but their economic models changed. Without tribute and ransom, they turned increasingly towards legitimate trade. The age of corsair fleets, once central to Mediterranean politics, was ending. With his mission complete, Stephen Decatur sailed for home. He had accomplished in months what Europe had failed to do in centuries, and he had done it without occupation, without conquest, and without permanent war. What remained was something even more lasting: a doctrine.
This part right here is the most fascinating, because I keep thinking, why didn't the North Africans go back on the deal? Or why didn't it require us to establish a diplomat? Or just what is perpetuating this? Why is this still, to this day, a fact of life over 200 years later? And I think it was just, I don't know, my head is swimming with ideas. A lot of it comes down to, there was a guy, middle of last century, that came up with dimensions of, I forgot what it was called. There's a cultural dimensions theory or something. And this Hofstede, I think is his name. Basically, he said that depending on your nationality, that is the biggest shaper of the way you think. And so I was employed at a company where I was going to travel abroad. And then prior to doing so, they gave me this book of, hey, here's a bunch of nations and how they think based on this theory. And so I looked at America, obviously. What are we all about? Highly individualistic, very not afraid to... We're not a face-based society. Like, we're not, hey, if you did something wrong, I'm going to tell you and we're going to fix it. Not, I have to protect your honor type of thing. If I were to expose this thing that you did wrong, there'd be a consequence. We're not about that at all. We're very pragmatic as a people. And I think this was what was feeding into this problem for the Europeans and just neighboring nations. And so the way they thought was very different. I think the closest I saw of the way Americans think would be the Germans from that perspective. But also on the flip side, the way that the societies of North Africa, so Algeria, Tunisia, the way they think and the way they honor compacts or agreements, that's clearly very long-lasting. Like, they have a very deep tradition of, this is what we're agreeing to, and that's it. So we've agreed. Whereas previously, they would have agreed to the ransoms, they would have agreed to the different payments, the tributes necessary, and they would have honored that. And so this whole thing is an exercise into examining how societies think, and also what to do when a bully keeps harassing you. So many lessons from this one pivotal moment in history.
The Americans told them how bullies are going to be handled. We're going to point a cannon at them.
Yeah, and I'm sure the stories had made their way there to say, oh yeah, they'll do that. This is not bluster.
The victories of Stephen Decatur in 1815 were more than tactical brilliance. They were the birth of a principle that would shape American foreign policy for centuries. For the first time, the United States acted decisively to protect commerce and citizens abroad. American ships, sailors, and merchants were no longer expected to pay for their safety. The government would enforce protection by force if necessary. This principle became a foundation of American naval doctrine. A strong, disciplined Navy ensures respect and safety for national interests anywhere in the world. Decatur and his men proved it worked. This campaign also taught practical lessons about naval operations. Speed and surprise were more effective than slow, cautious blockades. Concentration of force could achieve strategic goals without prolonged occupation. And decisive leadership mattered as much as firepower. In other words, you didn't need a massive fleet to change the balance of power. You needed a capable, determined fleet led by capable commanders. After 1815, the U.S. Navy carried these lessons forward. Protecting shipping became a national priority. Future interventions overseas would be framed around safeguarding American citizens and commerce. And diplomacy could be backed by credible force without relying on European allies. This philosophy influenced naval operations in the Caribbean, the Pacific, and even later interventions in the Mediterranean. Let's not forget the human side of this doctrine. The freed captives returned home to communities that had mourned them as lost. Families were reunited. Merchants and sailors resumed their lives, often carrying stories of hardships and resilience that inspired generations. It was a reminder that policy and strategy was not abstract. They had tangible consequences for real people. The Second Barbary War also set up for how the United States would be perceived abroad. A young nation could confront entrenched powers. Tribute and submission were not inevitable, and determination and disciplined naval force could change centuries-old systems. Even European powers began to reconsider their long-standing reliance on tribute. And within a few years, combined European forces would take similar action to enforce peace in North Africa. The campaign lasted mere months, yet its effects rippled across decades. 2 centuries of Mediterranean slavery and ransom diplomacy were disrupted. The principle of protecting commerce and citizens abroad became embedded in American strategy, and Barbary corsairs never again challenged the United States with the same impunity. The legacy of Decatur's squadron was not just victory, it was policy forged in action and a standard set for generations of American naval officers.
Yeah, this is the kind of story from American history that I really enjoy. It's where, like you said, we see a problem and then we face it decisively. There's no mincing words, there's negotiation, because how do you negotiate, hey, stop kidnapping my people? How about if it's only 10 people? Is that fine? You can't do that. It's either all or nothing. And coming in and saying, we need you to stop this, and if you don't, this is the consequence. Very clear, A, B, C. This is wonderful. This, I think, improved the lives of many, not just Americans, but Europeans, and possibly even North Africans. I think that's to have a system that is poaching. What is it I'm trying to say? When you have a life of piracy as a national agenda for your economy, that doesn't help you promote stuff internally for trade to enrich your society and have mutual benefits with not just you but your trade partner. Like it's all take instead of a give and take. So hopefully that would have helped. I guess would have to continue the story to see what happened to the economies of North Africa after that. But anyway, I do enjoy a good, solid show by the U.S. Navy for the freedom of humanity. This is just like the perfect story for me.
We've talked about strategy. We've talked about treaties. But the story of the Second Barbary War is also a deeply human story. When the American forces forced the Day of Algiers to release captives, about 500 men from 12 nations stepped out of dungeons and slave pens. Again, some had been prisoners for more than a decade. Many had endured harsh labor, malnutrition, and isolation. Some had never imagined they would see the sun again. Eyewitness accounts describe them blinking in the sunlight, shielding their eyes, and hesitating to move, as if stepping back into life itself. The freedmen were not just Americans. They were Italians, Spanish fishermen, Sicilian merchants, Portuguese traders, a multi-international group bound together by captivity. Families across Europe and America, long resigned to their loss, were suddenly reunited with sons, brothers, husbands, and fathers. The human impact cannot be overstated. Across Europe, diplomats and newspapers were stunned. Some were embarrassed that a young American republic had achieved what centuries of European diplomacy had failed to do. Others were inspired, realizing that tribute and appeasement were not inevitable. Within 2 years, combined Anglo-Dutch forces would use naval power to force Algiers into full surrender, a chain reaction sparked in part by Decanter's audacity. The Mediterranean was entering a new era. For Decanter and his men, success did not erase hardship. The campaign involved long sea voyages, uncertainty, and the constant risk of combat in hostile waters. But the reward, not just the treaties, but seeing human beings liberated, was extraordinary. One sailor later wrote, "To see men, haggard and thin, step onto our decks and breathe free air once more was worth every risk we faced at sea." It's a reminder, history is often measured in battles won, but it is truly felt in the lives restored. Decanter's expedition became a symbol. It told the world the United States would defend its citizens and commerce. The young nation could act decisively and effectively overseas. And courage, speed, discipline could overcome centuries of enriched power. It also sent a clear warning to would-be pirates. The age of easy tribute was over.
Well said. What a transformational time, just not only from a world diplomacy standpoint, but even just the individual lives of people that have been going about their business for generations, and all of a sudden everything changes because of the decisions of one nation. And then that encourages other nations to follow. Like you said, the Anglo-Dutch Navy says, oh yeah, we can do this. And they do. And I'm sure sailing in the Mediterranean today is a very safe endeavor, especially relatively speaking to the early 1800s.
The Second Barbary War reminds us power is effective when paired with principle. Naval capability protects not just commerce, but human lives. And young nations could shape international norms when guided by courage and foresight. When we remember Stephen Decanter and his squadron, it's not just for victories won at sea. It is for what they stood for: justice, initiative, and protection of the vulnerable. The Second Barbary War may not dominate history books, but its lessons were resonant, even today, for navies, policymakers, and anyone who values the courage to act when it matters most.
Agreed.
We want to honor one of our fallen angels, as we do at the end of every one of our episodes, with the help of HeroCards.us. And today we want to honor Second Lieutenant Herman Chuck Dreisen. It was from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Served with the U.S. Marine Corps, E Company, 2nd Battalion, 23rd Marines, 4th Marine Division. He received the Purple Heart. His date of sacrifice was March 6, 1945. Killed in action on Iwo Jima in Japan. He was 24. Herman Chuck Dreisen grew up in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, where he attended Villanova University from 1940 to 1943. Dreisen became a star basketball player for the Wildcats, leading the team to a 19-2 record in the 42-43 season, the highest winning percentage in the university's history, and a record that held for 72 years. According to Dreisen's nephew, in an interview with a former teammate, Herman Dreisen was described as a 6'2" sharpshooter who could do it all and who was a sure bet to make the fledgling NBA. After joining the military during World War II, 2nd Lieutenant Herman Dreisen was part of the first wave of Marines to land on the Japanese island of Iwo Jima in February of 1945. Known to American soldiers as the pork chop because of its shape, Iwo Jima is a small volcanic island 750 miles south of Tokyo, Japan. with an air base that could serve as a springboard to an invasion of the Japanese home islands. Iwo Jima was strategically important to both Imperial Japan and the American military. When U.S. Marines invaded the island on February 19, 1945, they encountered some 18,000 Japanese soldiers who had carved out an extensive network of caves, tunnels, and underground bunkers. The Japanese soldiers refused to surrender or be taken prisoner. For the U.S., taking Iwo Jima required them to brave heavy fire on the beaches and intense close-quarter assaults on the underground strongholds. On February 28, 1945, Lieutenant Dreisen led an attacking platoon on the early stages of the battle, penetrating deep into Japanese defenses east of Iwo Jima's sulfur pits. In an account from the Philadelphia Inquirer, Lieutenant Dreisen led his squad of 13 men who, cut off from their unit, advanced a quarter of a mile into enemy lines, knocked out 3 Japanese tanks, killed a dozen Japanese, and suffered only 1 casualty. A Marine Corps combat correspondent, describing the gallant attack, said Dreisen's men dodged from hill to hole, hiding behind blasted tree stumps and rock piles, and had to face not only Japanese fire, but also bombing, strafing, and rockets coming from American planes, which could not know that the small group 300 yards ahead of the front lines was a Marine patrol. Less than a week later, on March 6th, Lieutenant Dreisen lost his life on Iwo Jima. While ultimately victorious after 36 days of brutal fighting, the Americans suffered nearly 7,000 killed and more than 19,000 wounded, by far the highest single-action losses in Marine Corps history. Including those killed in naval bombardments preceding the invasion, the Japanese lost approximately 22,000 soldiers and sailors. Today, the victory at Iwo Jima is remembered for the flag raising on Mount Shuribachi, captured in Joe Rosenthal's Pulitzer Prize-winning photo. Lieutenant Herman Dreisen is honored by Villanova University with an annual Chuck Dreisen Award, given to a graduating athlete who demonstrates dedication, loyalty, and unsung heroism. Dreisen is also remembered by the Jewish War Veterans Organization, which named their Dreisen Weiss Post, number 215, in Philadelphia, in his honor. So, Second Lieutenant Herman Chuck Dreisen, we thank you.
Thank you.
All right, get us out of here.
All right. Hey, everyone. Thank you so much for listening. I hope you learned something. I always seem to, and it's pretty enjoyable. If you ever want to give us feedback, let us know how we're doing. There's a couple of different ways you can do that. First, you can rate and review us. Give us a very high number of stars. That would be really great. But be true to yourself. Hopefully, you feel like you want to give 5 stars. And then please do. Because when you do that, you help us get more exposure. We get to tell the story to more people, and they get to learn along with us. It's really wonderful. And yeah, we will send you heart emojis virtually across the ether. Alternatively, you can email us at the email address is usnavyhistorypodcast@gmail.com. You can send us a note, what you learned, what you liked, what you'd like to see. That way we can send emojis digitally via email. There's also different ways to get emojis if that's your thing. You can find us on X Twitter. Our handle there is @USNHistoryPod. And then you can say, whoa, you were way off on that thing. And then we can have a conversation or whatever. Or you can say, retweet, hey, these guys are the best. Hashtag Captain Dale for president or whatever. He probably doesn't want to be president. No, he's shaking his head very violently. Don't nominate him. He would be a calamity. Just, yes, he's agreeing with that. Okay. Finally, we have a Discord server. If you want to find that, it's in the show notes. You can join up. You can launch your own emojis to everyone. And yeah, we're so glad you're here. And if you liked what you heard, tell somebody you know that you think would like it too. Maybe, I always say family member, friend, classmate, but if you served with somebody and you're like, oh man, I know Ralph would really love this back in the platoon, go for it. Yeah, So anyway, thank you so much. We'll catch you next time, and we're very glad you were here.
And with that, we're going to wish you fair winds and following seas. Goodbye.
Bye.